how do you actually build a zero trust network? How do you segment? How do you architect it? This may be the number one question we get asked here, and certainly Rob Maas, who is our guest of today. Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Lieuwe, and here from the Security Operations Center for Add Onto It, we bring you the next episode, and that is about a Zero Trust Step 3. Build a Zero Trust architecture. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity.
Let me start by introducing our guest of today. His name is Rob Maas. He's a friend of the show. He is a producer of the show and a producer of Zero Trust. I know from a friend that in the morning he wakes up thinking about architecting Zero Trust networks. And before he gets to sleep, he is still thinking about architecting Zero Trust networks. So when we're talking about architecting, he's probably the best guy to want here and to talk to about this subject. Rob, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Zero Trust Step 3. Well, there have been Step 1 and 2. So before we dive into this, could you please refresh our memory a little bit? What did we do at Step 1 and what did we do at Step 2?
Okay, Step 1 is defining your protect surfaces. And that means that you're going to look to what you actually want or need to protect. And that should be what I call business domains or business applications. So you can think of your corporate website, your customer relationship management system, your ERP system, etc. So you define them, you put a lot of metadata around them. So who's the business owner of that protect services? So you know who you're going to call when you need to make changes or changes are needed. You specify the relevance, for example, what kind of data is in there. That's also important for Step 3, we'll see later. What kind of compliancy that protect service needs to comply with what frameworks. And all that metadata will help us further in the process, especially today with Step 3. Once we have these protect services defined, and just to repeat more or less what I said in that episode is, don't try to find them all at once. Just define 10 or maybe 15 and then pick 5 to continue with the next steps.
The whole idea of the Zero Trust journey is that you start small.
If you try to do it all at once, you will probably fail. So if you have a few of those protect services defined, then you pick your 5 most important ones, or you pick first one that you want to practice with, and then the 5 most important ones. Then you go to Step 2, where you define the flows of that protect service. So which protect service needs to communicate with what other protect services, but also with other sources outside of your network, maybe your third-party supplier, so you get also an insight in your supply chain, but also, for example, update services. You can also say that's my supplier, but sometimes they are viewed differently. That's Step 2, and then today we're going to discuss Step 3.
Yeah, so by now we know what's important to the business. Because you said relevance, that's like a ranking of relative importance within the organization. So we know our important assets, and we know who they talk to or what's needed from a flows perspective to make them work.
Yeah,
that's where we start off. Okay, yeah, and then we go to step. What's the goal of Step 3?
The goal of Step 3 is twofold. So on one side, you're going to design what kind of measures you need to get that protect service protected. So
what's a measure?
A measure is a control to circumvent a certain risk, to eliminate or minimize that risk.
It's really vague, Rob.
It's really vague still, but it's one side of the
example
of Step 3. So we said, okay, for example, this protect service needs to be segmented. It needs to have multi-factor authentication. It needs to have some kind of EDR tooling to protect us against ransomware.
So tangible things that you can do.
That you can do, but that's on one side. Mm-hmm. On the other side, once you define what you need to do, you also need to actually implement it. And that's also why I said it before, but Zero Trust is really a multidisciplinary approach, because you need different teams that work on Zero Trust. So for Step 1 and 2 are more in the strategic and tactical domain. But Step 3 is really where we bridge that gap and bring it to operations. Mm-hmm. And therefore we need architects. So an architect can then say, okay, but if you want to have these controls really into operations, he can translate that to high level and detailed level designs that then the engineers eventually
can. This is the thing you love, and that's why you wake up with architecture in your mind and sleep with architecture. Well, the first time I ever met Rob, that was in a situation like this, because there's typically whiteboards involved, right? And network drawings and figuring out, we have this firewall to our disposal, and now we need to segment this out, and we need to re-IP and all that, right?
Yeah, that's
Or
correct.
not?
Yeah. So whiteboards really come into play here and show their power.
Yeah, that was years ago. I remember this guy who had subnets defined for himself, and the number 42 was in there, and we were immediately friends because of this. Both ends of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, so let's see. So multidisciplinary, you said. Architects, is it mainly driven by architects, this step?
No, the driven should always be the business, and especially for Protect Service, the business owner, but also, of course, the CISO has a lot of things that he wants to have implemented as security, and you probably also be driven by compliancy frameworks. So there's a lot of different components that come into play. So you need the business owner, you need your architects. I always find it good if also someone from the operational team also is included, so we know what's coming, not that the architect defines something and said, okay, this is what I created, now implemented it.
That's impossible.
Can cause some friction indeed. So it's always good to have multiple people there. Yeah.
But before we actually start to make a network drawing or meddle with how Kubernetes is designed or how the cloud is being provisioned and all that, first, we need to assign measures, right? That's what you always do first.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
One thing first, it's not only about the network. It's really an architecture. Yeah. It's far broader than your network. So the first things we need to have that step 1 is properly done. That's really important. Otherwise, step 2, but especially step 3 will fail. So you need that information to come to the controls or measures that you want or need to implement. And the way we do that is you take your controls. We defined a set of 32 controls. Those are based upon the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but we have mapped them to, for example, the extended zero trust framework by Forrester. And CISA now has their pillars, but they are a bit vague on what controls you should really implement. So what we said, we create 32 controls.
Yeah, there needs to be a translation of it, both the CISA controls and also the CTX framework. Yeah. They really guide you through what needs to be done, right? But then the next step is the architect needs to be able to start, and the architect doesn't know. Yeah, do devices.
Yeah,
right?
so
do ISO.
Yeah, those frameworks are more on a strategic level, but they don't say this is what you really need to do in the operation side. And we define controls that are more aligned already with the operational side. So you need to think about multi-factor authentication or network segmentation, ransomware protection, those types of controls. They still need to be translated into something that fits for your organization, but you know what to look for and what to do. At least an architect should know.
How do you then decide? Because if I hear correctly, so assigning control, say we have our e-commerce website that is a protect service, clear protect service, right? And from step 1, we know which IPs they are or which object storage buckets are in there and which Kubernetes clusters are involved, right? So we know the technical mappings of that. We also know what it's going to talk to. Maybe it's some kind of CDN somewhere, it's a database somewhere, whatever, inventory system. But then you're going to decide what you need to do, what kind of things. So you say, do we need multi-factor? Don't you always need multi-factor, for example?
No, you probably don't have multi-factor on your guest Wi-Fi.
Yeah, so it is a choice per protect service whether you want those.
Yeah, so the per protect service. Yeah, per protect service we look at a few things. First, what kind of compliance frameworks are related to that? So e-commerce might have personal identifiable information in there.
That PCI DSS is what springs to mind immediately.
That's also one. You can translate that into your compliance frameworks. So if there is PCI information, then you need to comply with PCI DSS. And those compliance frameworks already stated a lot about what you should do on a technical level for protection and minimizing the risk. I often refer to ISO 27001 because it's a quite common framework, and it's pretty clear on the technical measures. So it says you need to do network segmentation. So it's already quite a clear measures. What we have done is we took all these compliance frameworks and mapped them to a set of controls, the 32 controls I just said. So now we know if you need to comply with PCI DSS, for example, then at least you should consider assigning these measures to that protect service. So meaning these are the measures I want to have implemented in order to comply with that framework.
Yeah, so to be clear, I have my e-commerce site. I know which compliance frameworks are there. Let's say it's PCI DSS, SOC 2, ISO 27001, and then you actually can make sure that you have, out of a list of 32 items, maybe a subset or maybe all of them, you define these you need to do. So in some way.
So and that really helps because not every measure maybe in on e-commerce you probably need a lot of measures because there's a lot of sensitive data. Black and white example here again is the gas network. You probably won't do. Maybe you segment it, or I hope you segment it. But that's more about
everything else, and all that's left is a gas network.
Exactly, yeah.
Which in itself then a segment. Yeah.
But it really helps you as a quick start because otherwise you need to go over every single control and decide if you want that control, yes or no. Also, probably the CISO has some set up a standard. Hey, these are the controls we always should consider to implement.
I mean, and if there's no authentication applicable, then maybe you don't have MFA is not in scope there. DDoS is one, right? That's also a control.
There's also a control. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't maybe make sense to do that on an internal system that's not accessible according to step 2.
Not
everywhere.
Often, indeed. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there you can turn the knob there a little bit.
And that's also the benefit here is because you do that per protect service. Every protect service get a really defined scope on measures that you need to implement, and that also means that your budget is really allocated to where it's most needed.
Mm-hmm. So it focuses your funds to also, where you need it.
That's a natural outcome of it.
Yeah. Okay, but every protect service, this is a lot of work, Rob. We're never going to do that.
Yeah, it is also why we start small. So you do that with the first few protect services, and you will also see that your whole environment, once you have done a few, will more or less turn into a zero trust architecture. So it will be more easy to attach new protect services because you already located your firewall, for example, on the right place, or you already have your cloud set up with the proper controls, or in Kubernetes you maybe already have implemented Istio, so your new protect service is easy to map.
So it's hard in the beginning, and it becomes easier over time.
The first few steps could be quite challenging.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned compliance frameworks, right? We briefly touched upon the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model. What about, you mentioned the MITRE framework as well. What's the relation with the MITRE framework?
The nice thing what you can do here is we had Rick Howard on the show about the cyber kill chain and how it can help to find the right protection for your environment. What we do is
the recap of the cyber kill chain is, listen, instead of needing to catch every bad guy every time, all the bad guys all the time, they only need to succeed once. Well, the kill chain actually gave the insight, well, that's not entirely true.
Turned that
they
around.
Have to go through different stages, and we need to catch them in one of those stages. That's what the kill chain.
Yeah. So we know once you look at the kill chain, you can apply a kill chain to your specific protectors because it should be really narrow scope. You know, okay, this is in there. So for e-commerce, you probably have outside access. Otherwise, it's hard to sell things. So you know what the kill chain looks like, and then you can put controls mapped to the what we often use is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you have the attack techniques. The kill chain is a set of these techniques, and every technique has MITRE mitigations. And by having that mapping, you can say, okay, this is what the kill chain looks like for this protect surface, and that means that if I implement these mitigations, there's a really good chance I will stop the attacker before he completely successfully.
So on one hand, you have a top-down approach where it always starts a bit vague to the architect. So do better or protect, almost at that level. That top-down all the way to those 32 controls. But on the other side, you're investigating the attacker's tactics more or less and translate that into a mitigation. And those come together at the controls level then.
Yeah, still at the controls level.
And that's only 32 things.
Yeah, we defined 32, but you can also do this exercise for yourself. But you
Could
don't
you
want
give
to
a few examples of those 32?
Yeah, we already mentioned a few of them, but flow segmentation is one. Other ones could be application detection, that you really want to see what application is there and that you want to have controls on the application level.
You mean the traffic is that you know for sure that
that you can see what application is going there instead of, hey, this is traffic. I see it's going over port 443.
So next generation firewall features.
More in most cases it is the next generation firewall, but we also have now software defined networking where these features pop up. Others are multi-factor authentication, of course, quite clear. You already mentioned DOS, DDoS attacks that you want to mitigate.
Those sound like things that you can actually implement, right? To an operational team, you can say, hey, listen, this is the stuff we're going to do. We do it for this protect service. These are the IPs. Go for it.
Yeah, that's maybe a bit too far-stretched to do it in one go. So the 32 controls indeed are on a level that people that understand.
No, but each of them, if we say of the 32, there's like 15 applicable that we want to do right now, then automatically a plan emerges from, I need to segment this.
Yeah, it depends a bit on the organization, I would say. I think quite often you still need that architect that translated, how do I implement this control? So let's say the segmentation into the environment. That in a traditional setup, it probably is being subnetting and routing. In cloud, it's often software defined. In Kubernetes, it's also software defined, but you look at network policies or Istio kind of solutions, service mesh solutions.
We're going to talk about that when we talk about the implementation of it, because I want to know a few things about that indeed, because there's lots of questions on what does it then actually mean, what segmentation is. One thing, you mentioned those measures. Is there like a order of importance of those? Are some more important than others, and why?
Yeah, so I would say segmentation is the most important one of all. It's also where Zero Trust originated.
So more important than multi-factor authentication?
Yeah, far more important. And the reason is...
Explain, because this is not common knowledge in the industry.
Yeah, so a lot of now that I think mainly the cloud vendor says multi-factor is the most important thing because they already did the segmentation on their end. So multi-tenancy, they already fixed that problem. Does not say that you don't want segmentation for your SaaS applications. The reason why segmentation is more important is there are a lot of vulnerabilities that don't care about authentication. So we saw it with Outlook Web Access. We also did a deep dive on it, that there was a remote code execution vulnerability without any authentication involved. So it basically bypasses the authentication and it could execute code.
Yeah, so to see if I understand this. So there is an internal application, for example, and there's multi-factor authentication on that application. And then there's what you're saying is we need to segment that out and be in control of the network flows, because my packet, if I have nothing to do with that application, say it's the HR department and I'm nowhere in there, so there's only a couple of people that need to log on to it, then yes, you can have multi-factor authentication on that app itself. However, if there's no one who can even send a packet from their laptop or whatever to that system, is far better, because you don't have to worry about all that stuff that you just talked about.
Yeah, you already eliminated a lot of possible bad actors trying to attack your, what application was it, HR? Yeah, I forgot about it.
Yeah, the HR one, for example.
So yeah, you can really minimize the attack factor, make that very small, and then still the vulnerability could be there, but if that vulnerability is there and only your internal employees are accessing it and it's only a limited set, then you can decide, okay, I know the vulnerability is there. Maybe the upgrade is very costly or very difficult. I will postpone it for a while because the importance and the risk is relatively low.
Yeah. Okay, understood. So at some point in step 3, we know for, let's say, the e-commerce portal, we need to do segmentation. We need to be in control of our flows, inbound, outbound. We need to do some kind of application detection, maybe SSL decryption. Betting is one of the controls.
Yeah, otherwise you cannot do application detection.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a list, right? And then we get this whiteboard, put the number 42 on it, and start architecting.
Yeah,
what does that look like?
Yeah, more or less. You get the architect involved, and then you're going to make a high-level design. You look at, hey, what do I have now? What should we have at the end? We know that then. And then we're going to design an infrastructure that would fit that. And that involves a lot of whiteboarding, see what's easy to do, maybe what's difficult to do, maybe even things that are at the moment impossible to do. Could be licenses, could also be complex infrastructure. And that's more or less setting up your high-level design. This is an approach that we can do. And that can include all controls that you want to implement. But it can also be some controls that are really difficult or near impossible.
Yeah, because typically, so say you have a virtualization environment and there's many servers in there, haven't really thought of protect services. So there's 2 different maybe application servers in the same subnet environment, VPC, whatever it is. And what you're saying is, hey, we need to segment. So we need to do this by application. So for clarity, that doesn't mean a segment is all the web tiers in one segment,
No,
and then all
that's
the
really a
app
bad idea.
tiers. Yeah, but it happens a lot.
We are,
right?
that's because we're coming from a design where we had the DMZ and the LAN, and that was appropriate at that time. But currently everything is connected. And that means that we put a lot of things in the DMZ and a lot of things in the LAN, and everything in the DMZ can talk laterally to each other. Also, we made a lot of holes in the firewall because that DMZ server, the web server, needs to talk to the internal database. So that design is basically flawed.
Yeah, so the flows from if you look at the flows in an architecture like that, there's a lot of flows from the between the web tier,
Application,
app tier and
database.
database tier, and not a lot of control that you can apply there. And therefore, you got to assume if you're in one of those servers in a certain application, well, you're in all of them, and then the next one right next to it is then also affected because lateral movement in the tier. So what we need to do is instead of making it in a vertical way. If the top layer is the web tier, and then the app tier below that, and the database tier below that. Instead of segmenting in horizontal slices, we need to make columns.
More or less. So
that's a paradigm shift for many organizations.
Yeah, a lot of.
Is it difficult?
I know the segment. Yeah. If you have an existing environment and go to the new environment, there are some challenges, especially if you really need to subnet, come up with a new IP plan, for example. But it's not difficult. It takes time and planning. What I also see is that a lot of engineers that are used to work in DMZ and LAN and really have that thought implemented, it's a really shift in mindset. And once, so some will struggle with it, but you see once they get the hang of it and understand why Zero Trust says, okay, you should really focus on the business application or the business domain, create one segment, and then in this case, it will be a network segment of it where you combine those things together. And
combine, you mean you have for one application, you have the web tier, the database tier, and the
application. Yeah, you can put them together. And then what we call a micro-perimeter, it's a term from Zero Trust, really segment it so no one has access unless really specifically created in the firewall.
Yeah, so if we're talking about a network-based application that you host in VMware, or maybe you have control of it, typically, if I hear you correctly, then what you're doing, you define a new zone or a new subnet or a new thing that is controlled by the firewall and migrate all the components of this particular, let's say, e-commerce site in there, re-IP it, redeploy it, or whatever. It depends on your environment, how difficult that is.
Yeah.
And define a policy. Or define the policies later for the next step coming up.
The next step.
Next week.
First thing is that you have to your architecture in place in order to do that. Yeah. Maybe good to add here, and that's so you put the web application database together. In most business applications, there's no problem. If you look at OT, you're not necessarily protecting the data, but the device. So it might be slightly different that you still need your PLC disconnected from your business logic, for example. Depends a bit on your OT setup. So that's the Purdue model. We'll not go there today, but it is good to know that the Purdue model really can work well together with Zero Trust.
Yeah, because the number talking about IT security, if we take that detour for a minute, is that all? Is network segmentation there also like crucially important? Is that the same thing? Because products that we see are based on detection and figuring out what you have, more of a inventory kind of products that we see, that in the market.
Yeah, that's what we see in if you go to OT. The Purdue model is more or less the standard there for years already. It's really also a segmented, layered approach like we had with the DMZ and the LAN in IT.
It's like the web tier, app tier, database tier.
More or less, but then the PLC, business logical, you have multiple layers, I believe 7 on top of my head. The few top ones are more or less the same. We had the enterprise layer, the DMZ layer, so that's really common with IT. And then you have the OT components that are also on several layers. But it's also the same thought that every component is of the same type. So like web servers and PLCs. PLCs are of the same time, web servers of the same type. We put them together. So it's more or less the same flaw that we saw in the DMZ setup.
So what's true for VMware environments, Azure environments, is also true for OT environments. Similar approach.
Yeah, the approach would be similar. Yeah.
Okay. End of detour. So what can go wrong in this implementation step then?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that, maybe not can go wrong, because if you do your architecture well, you should see the things that are becoming difficult or even near impossible. That could be, we're missing licenses for this product, or we miss this product at all. Maybe we don't have a core firewall at our data center where we can do this
maybe
segmentation.
I have a perimeter firewall and I have a happy server VLAN with everything in it, no firewalls.
Yeah, then,
so how am I going to achieve segmentation?
Yeah, so there's a traditional setup. Then the architect needs to decide, okay, can we make these segments on the perimeter firewall? What's involved with that? Maybe extra risk, maybe the firewall is too small, etc. Or should we really go to a core firewall or a next segmentation gateway, as it was called, and put the segments on there? That's really the architectural process. And if it comes out that you need a new firewall, then we can now bring it back to the business, because we have a business owner related to the protect service, and say, okay, this is what you want, this is what we have assigned, but it is not impossible at the moment. It will cost you this, or it will. We need this license upgrade, and then it's up to the business owner, and probably also with the CISO, to decide, should we invest?
Becomes a risk decision.
Yeah, it becomes a risk decision, and really for that protect service. So we really know this is the business domain. If it is e-commerce and this is your primary source of income for the business, you probably want to spend more budget there.
So instead of, if you have this situation where you have a perimeter firewall and nothing in the core, but your primary concern is 2-3 applications, maybe they don't even represent a lot of traffic, then you could even get like a smaller sized segmentation gateway or heart of the core firewall, whatever you call it. That's much more cost effective than the assignment of, hey, let's do it for the data center.
Exactly. Where we come from is okay, we have a data center, we need a firewall in there to protect everything. But now all these...
And the backplane is 100 gigs, so we need a 100 gig firewall. It's impossible to pay for.
Yeah, that's one side. So you can make it smaller and very precise for protect servers that need it. But another challenge we have nowadays is that a lot of companies are hybrid. So they're also in the cloud, and maybe even multiple clouds. So you can purchase a firewall, but that firewall will only work for that specific environment. So if you put your firewall in a data center, you cannot segment your cloud infrastructure, for example.
Yeah. That's why we need this architect, and depending on the situation, the platforms you're on, the technology that you're using. Why is the step 2 important here? Because I can imagine
the flows will already help you, for example, to decide where the connections are between the protect services.
Yeah, it might be that the connections are you can also scan in a different place, because that's the only connection you have. And you have a very simple, cheap deny rule for everything else locally in your environment, but the only connection you have at that end, there is a firewall, or it gets through the internet, so there is a firewall. And then that might save you some stuff. Okay, good. So what if it is hard and it is impossible?
So I think always important is what I saw a lot is that then the business owner said, okay, then we don't do it. But that's not, of course, how it works, because you still have your compliance framework dictating it, or you still want it because of company policy. So what you should do then is you make a decision. We're going to do it, or we're going to accept the risk by not doing it. By accepting the risk.
Now you don't say, hey, it's not possible. So it's not in scope. We don't assign the control. You still assign the control, but you say, hey, it's impossible for us for reason X, Y, Z to actually implement it, and therefore we take the risk.
Correct, yeah. And if you say, okay, we accept the risk, so you're not going to invest in, for example, this new firewall, you accept the risk, and you said, okay, this is why we decided to accept the risk. And that will also make it easier if let's say your firewall is up for renewal, or you have a license problem, and maybe your ALA is running out, then you can decide, okay, this is what we need to bring up into the discussion. This is a feature that we really want, or this firewall should be bigger because we have now these protect services.
At least you have the plan already, and then you know where you're lacking, and it's very common that you can't do perfect.
Exactly.
But it's very good to know where
you should know it, and especially when it comes to compliance framework, because then you often have the external auditors that will say, okay, but why is this missing?
Yeah, well, and if you've thought about it, and then
if you have a good reason, then
it's either we mitigate this risk and go bankrupt, or we don't go bankrupt, right?
Yeah, that's a good reason.
Because it's quite a good reason for the company's continuity. Yeah. All right, let's talk about evidence a little bit, because that's the last part of step 3, right? So we talked about assigning the controls, knowing what you want to do because of compliance, security reasons, or whatever, and then implementing it, making the translation to the network diagram that you love so dearly.
Yeah.
And then evidence. What about that?
And once again, it's broader than a network diagram. But the next step, there's one step in between. So you have this diagram, then of course the engineering teams needs to implement it. And then once they have done that, they can say to you, okay, we have implemented it. But how do you then prove that it's actually there, that it's really working? Is SSL decryption doing its job? Can we see the application, for example? So you really need to get evidence or proof that it is really working. That's also something that's being asked in a compliance audit.
Yeah, especially the heavier controls, like heavier frameworks like SOC 2, for example, that really want you to prove that
you have to bring evidence
compliant every time. And you do this per control then?
You do this per control, per protect surface.
Yeah. And then why is that? Does it make that easier? Why can't we say?
Yeah, because sometimes maybe you have controls that can prove it for all protect surfaces. But since we assign controls per protect surface, you also should bring the evidence per protect surface, because then you can say, okay, this protect surface is completely aligned with all the controls that we are required by compliance, or that we at least assign to it. So you can have an overview per protect surface how well you are doing.
Yeah. Okay. Clear. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times. I want to circle back a little bit to your remark constantly. Hey, this is not just networking, because and the reason many people think it's networking, and a lot is in networking in some form. And Zero Trust, let's be honest, started with network architecture, network segmentation, indeed. But that was in the world where everybody was still using. I mean, Zero Trust is quite has come a long way. Initially, we were all using. Still loving VMware, basically. But so how is this, for example, maybe in Kubernetes or in cloud or so? What's the equivalent there? If we want to segment the network and be in control of the flows.
I think there are two answers to this question. So first, you have segmentation. So the creating of the microperimeter, as it's called. So really segment your protect service. Traditionally, that was all about networking, creating sublets, routing, more or less.
With a firewall as the router.
Then cloud came along, and we needed to find the defined service, defined networking there, which is often also done by mimicking routing. So it's a little different, but how you work on it is more or less the same. Then we get like things like Kubernetes, where it's already a bit more trickier.
How does that work? Because I'm not going to make a Kubernetes environment for every application, for every protect service, or am I?
That's probably a bit too expensive. You can do it. Depends on, again, how far you want to stretch this segmentation. But you have also tools in Kubernetes. You can even go for a subnet with routed setup if you want. But more common is a service mesh, and that means that this service mesh is more or less in control of all your flows between all the pods in your Kubernetes environment, and where you then dictate the policy, who's allowed to communicate with whom, and what kind of authentication, for example, do I want to have on that communication. Does it need to be encrypted, etc. So then you have a service mesh solution, but that's all about still.
So we're talking about Istio, Linkerd, those kind of solutions where in a manifest it's dictated like this pod can talk to that pod on that URL, right?
Correct.
Which is much like a firewall if you think of it.
Yeah.
From a firewall perspective, and from a Linkerd perspective, it's much like a firewall is much like your manifest that actually tells you exactly this is the flows you're implementing. You're defining the flows that are possible. So that's mapping to two.
Yeah, what we have done is we call this this control flow segmentation. So it's, of course, it will often map to networks, but not necessarily. On the other end, so the second part of that answer to that question is, we also have controls that have nothing to do or not likely to do anything with network. So like multi-factor authentication is mostly done on the application level or on a service that's put in front of your application. So there's nothing in there with the with networking. You do that purely on the application on a layer before that. Ransomware protection is often an endpoint that runs on the client, and then it has kinds of systems to detect if ransomware is being applied. Also has nothing to do with networking, but there are all controls that you need to implement to get your protect surface safe.
Yeah, and the control for endpoint protection is indeed installed everywhere and validate that every machine has one.
Yeah, and that this feature is turned on.
Yeah. You can make like in every security product, you can make an exception that effectively renders the control useless.
The challenge here is that these configurations are still often done by hand, not always, but that means that someone can easily make a mistake, and then you have your endpoint running, but it's not doing anything, or it's only on alerting mode instead of blocking, etc.
It's a lot to unwrap in step 3, Rob.
Yeah, I think this is if you look at the time that it takes, this is the most time-consuming step.
initially then.
Initially, yeah.
Right? Yeah, because that's our experience. The first couple are hard, maybe harder at least.
Yeah, well, like what we just let's say you have a Kubernetes environment with multiple protect services in it, and once you have installed that service mesh, all the others can also benefit from it. So you take away, make that step for the other ones much easier.
Once you've done it for one or two applications, maybe you do one in your legacy visualization platform on-prem, one in your Azure, one in your Kubernetes.
Yeah, you really start growing in your Zero Trust architecture, and that means that
you
it
have
really
reference
comes to you.
architectures in your
Also,
organization. Yeah. Okay. Do you have some pointers to the audience? What should you do in order to don't make the same mistakes as you've been learning for the last. I remember once we were at a conference for Kubernetes. Kubernetes was the subject, and Rob went to a talk that was 10 ways to shoot yourself in the foot with Kubernetes, and he said, "I'm gonna extend that list for us." Yeah. So tell us about it.
There are a lot of things. So the most important one here is start small and don't get encouraged by still looking at the whole environment. Of course, you need to take that into account when you implement something, or especially when you need to
that's the downside of architects. Put 3 architects in a room, and you get an over-engineered plan that nobody knows how to execute.
Exactly. So you need to have the planning. You have to know the whole picture, but you're planning for a few protectors
on the short term.
On the short term, yeah. But
and be agile.
Yeah, and then the only thing that you need to have the plan in your back is that if you need to purchase a new firewall, then it might be as well for the other protectors that you know they are coming. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the important parts, because if you try to do it all at once, you will probably fail. You have too many changes in your architecture or in your infrastructure.
What should be the first and the second protect service that you choose? What are characteristics of those? Probably not my main e-commerce website.
No. What there's this learning curve where you can where there is more or less stated, and I think it's a good idea, especially if you do everything yourself. Start with a learning protector. So I think that's not very of importance to the business. So you can, if you fail, then nobody, or at least only a few people care, and you can inform them, hey, this is what we're going to do. But just to learn, how do we set this up? We have this great architecture in mind. How does it work?
Probably no customer impact, like the PTO days registration system, something like that. Or
I would not go there at the first. That's the first protect service. No. But once you have done that and you feel confident that it works, then you go to the second one. And then again, keep it small to prevent the impact on the business, and that you really have a good plan. Hey, we need to make changes, and especially in the beginning days, they can be quite trivial to do well, because otherwise it will fail. Network changes, for example. So keep them small, and it's good to start with something that's not important and then grow into the important ones.
Okay. To close off with, Rob, can people call you if they want some more info on this? Maybe there's questions from the audience. Send them in, team@threat-talks.com. We can discuss them in more detail in the next episode, because there's a lot to unwrap in step 3. Huh? Yep. Step 4 and 5 are also a lot of work, maybe, but probably easier to understand.
Yeah, this is really the translation where you come from the idea of Zero Trust to really implement it and operationalize it. That's also why I like this idea, because now we're not talking about it, we're really doing it.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. That sums it up for now, I'm afraid. And to our audience, well, thank you for tuning in today. If you like this, help us, please. Subscribe to our channel, like it. It helps us spread the word, and others benefit from it as well. Contact us if you have any questions, if you want something on the agenda. We'd love to hear from you. And here from the Security Operations Center, Florida Onto It, I thank you very much for tuning in, and hope to see you next Tuesday for the next episode of Threat Talks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by Onto It Cybersecurity and AMS-IX. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.